So again, yesterday what we looked at was I gave you 2 endpoints, and I asked you to find the midpoint. And we used the formula, x1 plus x2 over 2, y1 plus y2 over 2. And we found that value. Today what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the midpoint. I'm going to give you an endpoint, one of them. You're going to have to work backwards to find the other endpoint. Okay, so you're not going to use the midpoint formula. I don't want you to find the middle of that. I want you to find the other endpoint based on that midpoint. I'm going to show you 2 ways to do it. Some of you that are logical thinkers and others that are algebraic and like a formula and a substitution and a plug-in, I'll show it both ways. Okay, the logical way is much easier, but I will show it both ways. So, the midpoint of segment DG is M. Okay, so first of all, right above this, I'm going to write the word midpoint out again. Just to remind myself that it's not an endpoint, because if you write it as an endpoint, you'll do the wrong formula. Okay. One of the endpoints is D, 1, 4. Find the coordinates of the other endpoint. Now, we don't have a coordinate plane. If we did have a coordinate plane, we could actually graph them and look at it and then maybe like estimate a little bit going the other direction. But for the purposes, I just draw a segment, and you have this on your paper. You'll see the next example doesn't have one, so you would draw one by yourself. Now, it doesn't really matter. Well, they tell us it's DG, so let's go ahead and put D here, G here, and our midpoint. I really could put G on the other side. We don't know necessarily, but. So let's put the ordered pairs there. D is 1, 4. And again, this isn't graphed like accurately. We're not using the coordinate plane. We're just like sketching it and marking it, because really -1 would be like over here. But just leave it as is. And I want to find the coordinates of the other point. So the logical way to do this is to remember that the midpoint is going to be the same distance away from both endpoints, right? So if you compare the x values, how did they get from 1 to -1? What did they add or subtract to get from 1 to -1? 1 plus what gets me -1, or 1 minus what gets me -1? Marquise? Good. They subtracted 2. So to find the other endpoint, you would have to subtract 2 again. So 1 minus 2 would get me -3. Now, the y coordinates are going to have a different relationship or pattern between them, so we're going to look at them separately. So now let's go to the y's. 4 went to 5, so the y value actually increased 1. So you're going to continue that pattern, and you're going to increase 1 again. And that's your answer. So the answer is G is -3/6. Okay, that's the easiest way to do it. Now, for those of you that are algebraic and like a formula, you can actually use the formulas that we used yesterday. So I'd like you to write this in your notes, even though the majority of you aren't going to do this. I would still like you to have it, because it's good to review algebra anyways and how this would work algebraically. So yesterday we learned the formula x1 plus x2 over 2, and that was the midpoint x value. I'm going to actually let that be equal to x sub m, which is the midpoint x value. Does that make sense? And then I'll do, so I'm just kind of splitting up that formula from yesterday into 2 formulas. So the y coordinate was y1 plus y2 over 2, and that got me my midpoint y value. So what you can do is you can actually plug in the values. Okay, this would be my x1, y1. The other endpoint would be x1, y2. Now remember, at the beginning I didn't know x2, y2. Remember, I didn't know that. That's what I was asked to find. Okay, so you would actually leave it as variables. And then the point that was given to me in the middle would be called x sub m, y sub m, because it's the midpoint's x value and the midpoint's y value. Then you would sub in and you would just use algebra. Okay? So x1 is 1. x2, okay, remember at this point we didn't know what this was, so I'm going to go ahead and erase it. We were asked to find this. So I would leave it as x2 all over 2 equals x sub m, which is negative 1. Then you would have to solve for x2. So the first thing, the numerator is really grouped because it has a big denominator. So I would first undo division of 2 with multiplication of 2. So we have 1 plus x sub 2 equals negative 2. Then I would need to undo addition of 1 with subtraction of 1. And I would get x sub 2 equals negative 3. Okay, so that would be my x value of point G, which we did find, right, when we did our pattern. You would do the same thing for the y values. So y1 was 4. y2, at the time, we did not know what that is, so that would just stay as y2, our unknown, all over 2, equals y sub m, which we have as 5. Again, we would solve this for y2. So the first thing we would do is undo the division with multiplication. Oops. Then I would undo addition of 4 with subtraction of 4. Now we get 6. Then the last thing you would do is take each of those answers and put them together as an ordered pair. Now, why do I show both ways? Some students will struggle to do the first part, which most of you will think it's really easy, but a couple students will always struggle, and they like a formula that always works, that like they can check, and it makes sense to them algebraically if you're an algebra learner. The majority of you aren't going to want to do that much work, right? You're just going to look for the pattern and continue it. Okay, that's fine. But you just need to be careful if you do choose the pattern way that you don't screw it up somehow. Because if it's a 4-point question and you don't have any work except for like your pattern, you could lose all 4 points if you got it wrong. So just kind of double check it. Okay, let's do one more. So this one says the coordinates of t are 1, 12. The midpoint of ST has coordinates. Now, another way students will mess this up is that they won't read this, and they'll find the midpoint between these 2 points, just like rushing. They'll use the midpoint formula like from yesterday. So just make sure that you read that this is the midpoint. I'm not asking you to find the midpoint. I'm giving you the midpoint. I'm asking you to find the other point. So let's sketch a picture. Again, if you wanted to, you could really draw an X, Y, and like graph it accurately. But for our instances, I'm just going to draw a segment. I'm going to put the midpoint, which actually I should have added markings in the last one. Go back to the last picture and add markings since they told me it was a midpoint. Because we should always be in the habit of doing that. All right, so they tell me the coordinates of t. Now, it doesn't matter if you put t here or t here. It really does not matter. Most students, since they see st, will label this s and this t, I think. But it doesn't really matter. And then this would be our midpoint. So the coordinates of t are 1, 12. The coordinates of the midpoint are 5, negative 8. And it's kind of good I set it up like this one because this one will go backwards. Find the coordinates of s. Do we want to do the shortcut? Yes. Thank you. I will show, I'll add on to the end of the video, I'll show it algebraically on Google Classroom in case anyone wants to watch. So first look at your x values. It went from 1 to 5. So what did they do with the x values? You have to start at an endpoint and go to the midpoint, and then go from the midpoint to the other endpoint. Justin? They added 4. Okay, you don't want to go from here to here because then you have to do the opposite backwards. So it's easier to go endpoint, midpoint, endpoint. Then you continue the pattern, and we will add 4 again. So 5 plus 4 is 9. Okay, now be careful. Now it's our y's. To get from 12 to negative 8, what did they do? Katie? They subtracted 20. So 12 minus 20 is negative 8. So we need to do that again. Negative 8 minus 20 is negative 28. So the coordinates of S are 9, negative 28. Okay. Now on the back I put a mixture of problems. Notice it says extra practice at the top. I'd like you guys to go ahead, move around if you'd like. You don't have to work with your pair share partner. Work with a partner. I'm going to give you about 10 minutes, maybe 8 to 10 minutes to do those 3 problems. They're all different, so they're using yesterday's and today's. So you want to pay attention. They might be asking you for the distance, they might be asking you for the midpoint, or they might be asking you for an endpoint. Okay, so make sure you read carefully. Move around, work with a friend, and we will come back together and share our answers to those. If you're struggling while you're working, or if you're working independently, just raise your hand. I can come around and help you. Okay, but I'd like you guys to try all 3 of these on your own, and then we'll... Okay, so for example 3, it did ask us to find AB, which we haven't seen before. When they ask you to find AB, they're actually asking you to find how long is AB, or the distance from point A to point B. You're only going to find the midpoint when it actually says find the midpoint. So we would be using our distance formula. Remember, the song can help you to memorize it. x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. Add them together and take the square root. If not, just memorize it however you would like. Also make sure you label the points appropriately. x1, y1, x2, y2, point 1, point 2. And then we'll plug in. Negative 4 minus 1 is negative 5 squared. Now our 2 negatives here are going to turn into a positive, so 4 plus 3 is 7.
Excuse the interruption. Any student who has signed up for the Muskegon University visit, please report to the guidance department at this time.
Negative 5 squared is positive 25, because that's negative 5 times negative 5, which is 25. And 7 squared is 49. We add those together, we get 74. And then we would type that into our calculator. So I'm just going to use my simple calculator here. And we'll round that to the nearest tenth, which is approximately 8.6 units. Okay, the next one we have says find the coordinates of the midpoint. So you're finding the midpoint. If you'd like, you can go ahead and draw the segment. We have segment X, Y. X has coordinates 2, negative 5. Y has coordinates of 6 and 13, and we're finding the value of M, the midpoint, which is in the middle. If you want, you could use the pattern to find out how long the distance from 6 to 2 is, and then cut it in half and add it back. But I would just use our midpoint formula from yesterday, which was average the X values and average the Y values. Okay, remembering that this would be point 1, x1, y1, and point 2, x2, y2. So we'll substitute in those values. You're going to make sure you simplify the numerator of that fraction first. There's technically, a group around this because of that big denominator bar. 6 plus 2 is 8. Negative 5 plus 13 is also 8. And 8 divided by 2 will get me that the midpoint has coordinates 4, 4. Now, if you wanted to use the patterns we talked about today to check that, 2 plus 2 is 4, 4 plus 2 is 6. Negative 5, how would we get to 4? Have to add 5 to get to 0, and then add 4, so that would be plus 9. And then 4 plus 9 would get me 13. So you can double check that by using the pattern we looked at today, because we know the midpoint has to be equal distances from either of the endpoints. And then the last one says that the midpoint of xy has coordinates of 4, negative 6. So this is the value of the midpoint. So again, some of you may like to sketch your segment. We have segment x, y. Midpoint is M. Again, the midpoint is congruent, creating two congruent segments. So at the midpoint, I will put 4, negative 6. And at x, I will put 2, negative 3. We're asked to find the coordinates of y. Okay, now I'm going to show this one algebraically, and then I'll show it with the pattern, since I did the pattern for the other ones. So if you're doing the algebraic version, you're going to use the formulas. x1 plus x2 divided by 2, but you're actually going to set it equal to xm. And y1 plus y2 divided by 2 equals y sub m. You would let this be our x1, y1. This will be our xm, ym, and this will be our x2, y2. Substitute in your values. So 2 is x1. x2 we don't know, so you're going to leave that as a variable. X sub m is 4. We'll solve that. So undo division of 2 with multiplication of 2. Then undo addition of 2 with subtraction of 2. So we'll get that x sub 2 is 6. Same thing for the y's, but doing our y values. So y sub 1 is negative 1. Y sub 2, we don't know, so we'll leave it a variable. All over 2 equals y sub m, which is negative 6. Again, because of this big fraction bar, the first thing you have to undo is the division of 2 with multiplication of 2. And then lastly, we will add 1 to both sides. Oops, I copied the wrong number. Let's go back. Where did I get negative 1? Our y1 is negative 3. So let me change that. That's my mistake. So we have y1 plus y2 divided by 2 equals y squared. Now we look a little bit better. Multiply by 2 on both sides. And undo a negative 3 by adding 3 to make this become 0. And then we'll take these two answers and we'll put them together as an ordered pair for a point y, which would be 6, negative 9. Okay, so that's our algebraic way to do it. If you were doing it using your pattern, which a lot of you seem to like, let's look at the x values up here. We would have 2 going to 4 would be adding 2 to the x value. So we're going to add 2 again. 4 plus 2 will get me 6. Oh, see how that matches? Now the y values again are going to have a different pattern. So it's going from negative 3 to negative 6. So they are subtracting 3. Negative 3 minus 3 is negative 6. And so we have to continue that pattern yet again. Negative 6 minus 3 is a negative 9. So again, a lot of you will like that pattern way, which is perfectly fine as long as you're careful. okay? Because some of these problems on your test will be worth 3 or 4 points, perhaps, and all I'm looking at is this answer. So if you get one of these wrong, it would be, and you have no work shown except your pattern, you're gonna miss 2 points if it's a 4-point question. If you got both of them wrong, you're gonna miss all 4. Okay, if you choose to do it algebraically, you will have work to support your answer. I could find your mistake somehow. Maybe it was a copying mistake here or there. But just be really careful. Maybe double check your answer a couple times if you're doing it with the shortcut. Right, the closure just has us again to remind us to memorize our distance and midpoint formula. And just be careful again if you are doubling up in Honors Algebra 2 as well, that you don't get some of these formulas mixed up with our slope, point slope, and standard form equations that we're looking at right now in there. Okay. Don't forget that we do have a Chapter 1 test coming up on Tuesday the 19th.